What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
I did not plan revenge. I planned silence, because silence, when it sits beside a plate of cheap noodles and the soft glow of a living room lamp, can feel cleaner than any toast raised by people who need an audience for their kindness. And when my sister's message slid across my screen that afternoon, "Dinner is just for the successful ones. Hope you understand," I felt that familiar pinch behind the ribs, the one that shows up when you are the designated understudy in your own family. Yet I let the pinch pass, opened the delivery app, and ordered the kind of takeout that comes in a paper bag sweating with steam, then set my phone face down as if it were a loud guest who had already said enough. The hook of that night was not the insult, but the restraint, because I could have fired back a paragraph about how success is not always photogenic and does not always fit in a caption, and how some of us were building things without confetti cannons and filtered carousels, yet I knew a reply would be treated like proof that I am too sensitive, so I let the line go slack, turned up the volume on the old playlist that I use for working nights, and, while the neighborhood warmed itself in the orange of early evening, I walked through the small apartment tidying the evidence of my week, sticky notes with sketches of product funnels, coffee cups with rings like tree growth, a sweater draped over the back of a chair as if I had vanished mid-sentence, until the knock at the door delivered dinner and the first uncomplicated kindness of the day. I ate on the couch because the couch forgives everything, and I ate with the slow stubbornness of someone refusing to join a performance, and the sauce left a bright smear on the cardboard lid that looked a little like a sunrise, which felt rude and encouraging at the same time. And while I twirled noodles, I let my mind drift through the Museum of Older Hurts, where my sister's voice narrates exhibits about real careers and dependable choices, where my mother laughs a little too loudly at jokes made by men who speak in slides, where the family group chat becomes a bulletin board for everyone else's milestones and a suggestion box for mine, filled with tips on how to be smaller, quieter, easier to love. If you have ever been told to be grateful for a chair in the corner, you learn how to enjoy corners, and I did, with the cat making a circle and collapsing into a loaf at my feet, with the TV on mute whispering headlines I did not need, with the kind of stubborn peace that comes only once you have stopped auditioning, and yet beneath that peace ran a wire of anger I used like a handrail, steadying, because there is a point where you understand that surviving long enough to be underestimated is its own kind of weapon, and it does not require noise. My laptop sat on the coffee table like a sealed envelope that has been waiting for the right breath to open, and I told myself I would not check email after 8, because that is a rule I only pretend to follow, and then I broke it. Because that is a rule I only pretend to care about, and there it was, a subject line from our council with the kind of punctuation you never see unless something irrevocable has happened, and before I clicked, I did what a petty person with a sense of humor might do. I scrolled back to my sister's message, took a screenshot, and dropped it into a folder called Receipts, not because I wanted to humiliate her later, but because sometimes you need a fossil to remind you that the ground you are standing on used to be a swamp. While the city outside went glossy with evening, I read the email twice, then a third time to make sure my heartbeat was not translating wishful thinking into legal English, and the language was dry and heavy with certainty. And the numbers were written in letters so long they looked ceremonial, and though I said nothing out loud, I felt the old floorboards inside me shift, as if a house that had learned to lean had suddenly remembered how to stand straight, and I laughed, not the cute kind of laugh people put on voicemail, but the kind that bursts out when the math finally balances and you realize you have been carrying the remainder for years. I did not call anyone, not even the friend who answered every what if at 2 in the morning, not even the mentor who taught me to let a win sit quietly until it could walk on its own, and I certainly did not call home, because home had decided to dress up as a velvet rope that night. So I did something small and slightly mean that tasted like justice without the calories. I opened the family group chat, scrolled past the selfies from the dinner I had not been invited to, the raised glasses, the captions about our circle, the smiling faces that had always mistaken volume for value, and I left the chat without a note, then turned off location sharing, then changed my contact photo to a blank gray, the digital equivalent of shutting a door without slamming it. The playlist rolled into an old song from a summer when I could not afford air conditioning and dreamed of a day when my name would appear in someone else's calendar for reasons that were not about errands. And I realized I was holding my breath the way people do when they know the next step is going to make a sound. And I thought about the word deserving, how it gets used like a stamp by people who have never built anything except an audience. And I decided I was done auditioning for their stamp, and that was the closest thing to revenge I had ever allowed myself, choosing to stop making my life easy for the people who found it easy to judge. I rinsed the takeout cartons, wiped the counter so it would not look like a confession in the morning, set my phone to do not disturb with the satisfaction of a bouncer unhooking a velvet rope, and opened the email one more time. Because repetition is how you teach the body to trust the mind, and because I wanted to see the line again where counsel wrote that the agreement would become public upon the release of a midnight statement, and the phrase "upon the release" landed in my chest like a key turning, and before I could decide whether to pour a victory drink or brew a calming tea, the lock screen lit my living room with a pale banner that carried my name and a fragment of the subject line, and for a second I thought the TV had unmuted itself, until I leaned closer and saw the words I had waited years to read, "Confidential no more," the statement timed, the news already rolling toward the world while my sister raised a glass to a room that had declared itself successful without me. When the next notification rolled in and the preview changed everything I thought I understood about what would happen before morning. The preview line that slid across my lock screen carried my name stitched to the kind of headline that does not ask permission to enter a room, and in the thin blue light of the phone the words unspooled into a sentence that felt both ceremonial and intimate, announcing that the acquisition papers were executed and the consideration was valued at $120 million, which is a phrase that looks like a parade when written by lawyers and feels like a quiet heartbeat when read. Alone on a couch that still smells like soy sauce, and as the embargo lifted the story leapt from one outlet to another like a match tossed into dry grass, while my apartment, small, patient, and used to hearing me fail in private, listened to the world say my name as if it had always known how to pronounce it. Notifications stacked like dominoes trying to outrun gravity, and each one carried a different version of history where someone had always believed in me. Except that in my version I could remember the meetings where I pitched until my throat went sandpaper and the investor smiled with his mouth while his eyes looked over my shoulder. The job where my old boss called me ambitious like it was a diagnosis. And the relationship where the man I loved said he needed someone more stable, by which he meant someone who would not choose a dream over a dinner reservation. And in this chorus of congratulations I heard the absence that mattered most: no message from my mother, no message from my sister, because the night was still young on their end and the dinner for the successful ones had not yet given up its stage. The article on my screen used careful verbs and clean numbers, then quoted my co-founder about our team of 8 and our improbable path. And although the writer did not know it, he had included a small mercy by listing the names of the junior engineers who had taken pay cuts and the contractor who had fixed our DevOps at 3 in the morning for coffee and gratitude. And I saved that paragraph like a souvenir, because one day it would matter that we remembered the people who welded the bridge, while everyone else critiqued the paint, and then I did the smallest, sharpest thing I could think of that would require no speeches and no apology. I opened LinkedIn, wrote a thank you note that named the handful of believers who stood in the rain with me, tagged the barista who handed me extra espresso shots with the conspiratorial tenderness of a field medic, and the mentor who once printed my deck at midnight because the office printer would not, and then, with the same hand that had spent years knocking on doors that did not open, I did not tag family at all. It took 3 minutes for an uncle to text the old number he keeps for emergencies, 3 more for a cousin to slide into my email with a subject line that read, "Proud of you, kiddo," as if we had ever spoken like that, and by the time the first "we should catch up" hit my inbox like a stray balloon, someone at the dinner must have noticed the news drifting through their table conversations because my sister called, let it ring twice, hung up, then called again, which is how she is always. Demanded attention, rapid, repetitive, impossible to ignore, so I did what adults do when they remember they have choices. I let it go to voicemail, and I reopened the legal email so that my eyes would be busy with the language of commitments rather than the language of need. When she texted, she reached for plausible kindness. We were just about to invite you. It was all so last minute, and I could feel the sentence wobble under its own costume, so I replied with a sentence that was accurate and unarguable, telling her that I was under communications guidance from counsel and the acquiring company's PR team through the weekend, which was true enough to be useful and distant enough to be educational. And then I added a line that she would understand later if not now, that I would be happy to meet for coffee next week if she could send a calendar request with an agenda, because nothing confuses a person who trades in favoritism like being handed a process that treats them like everyone else. Old colleagues appeared in my messages like postcards from a country I had once escaped. My former boss posted a glossy paragraph about how he always knew I would do big things, and I considered liking it for the sport of it before deciding that oxygen is better spent elsewhere. While journalists asked for a quote, and the acquiring company's comms lead sent me a short list of approved lines that sounded like the elevator music version of my actual feelings, and I picked one, delivered it cleanly, and discovered that professional diplomacy can taste like victory if you remember to season it with boundaries. Around 11, with the city sliding toward that hour when even loud neighbors go quiet, I opened the photo app and found the screenshot I had saved of my sister's successful one's message. Then I took a different kind of picture by writing a second post. Not triumphant and not bitter, a simple note about our scholarship plan for first-generation founders who keep building after being told to wait their turn. A note that promised mentorship hours and legal consultations and a monthly stipend to cover the boring expenses that actually sink people: rent during a pivot, childcare during a launch, dental work during a funding winter. And I scheduled it to go live at dawn with one line that was pointed enough to feel like a scalpel and polite enough to pass the grandmother test. For those who showed up before the confetti, the door will always be open. I brushed my teeth with the electric hum of a person who has spent years borrowing confidence and suddenly finds a little of her own in the medicine cabinet, changed into the soft t-shirt that knows more about my failures than anyone else, and stood by the window long enough to watch a rideshare drop off someone wearing the kind of perfume that makes a hallway believe in happy endings, and I let myself think one uncharitable thought about the dinner I had not attended, imagining the pause at the table when the first phone lit up with my headline and the tiny, private recalculations that would ripple down the linen like a rumor, because sometimes revenge is nothing but the moment arithmetic catches up to memory. Before midnight, I made one call, not to family, not to the ex who would be texting by morning, but to our counsel, to ask how firm my obligations were around post-close communications with non-stakeholders. Which is a bloodless way to say people who want to act like shareholders when they never risk dissent, and when counsel confirmed that my best move was to keep it courteous, keep it public, and keep it documented. I felt the last remaining thread of obligation snap without noise, so I activated a new focus mode on my phone named Before Midnight, allowed only the contacts who answered when I had nothing to offer, and routed every other call to a voicemail greeting that thanked them for their excitement, linked to the official press page, and invited them to email my assistant, an assistant I did not yet have but would by morning, while my sister's fifth call rolled gently into that polite machine and left 3 minutes of carefully calibrated enthusiasm that ended with a request to meet tomorrow, which I let sit in the dark like a glass of water left out for a guest who has not yet decided whether to knock, as the city clocked over to a new day and my scheduled post waited like a quiet fuse that would burn through breakfast. The morning came in quietly, with that thin gray light that makes everything look softer than it is, but my phone screen ruined the illusion before I even finished my coffee. The notifications were endless: calls, texts, mentions, tags, messages from numbers that had gone silent years ago. There were old classmates reminding me how they always knew I had it in me, ex-colleagues who once rolled their eyes at my ideas now sharing articles about my success like proud relatives, and relatives acting like they hadn't spent half their lives pretending I was invisible. I scrolled through the noise, half disgusted, half entertained, because the truth about sudden success is that it exposes loyalty faster than failure ever could. Everyone loves a story that ends well, as long as they can pretend they helped write it. My sister's voice message came next, and even before I pressed play, I could feel the syrupy tone she had poured over every word. "We were actually going to invite you," she said, her voice performing contrition like a well-rehearsed monologue. "It just came together so fast last night, and Mom thought you might be too busy." I listened twice, not because I cared, but because I wanted to measure how much effort it took her to lie that smoothly. The woman who once laughed about my silly startup hobby was now pretending she had simply miscounted the chairs. I didn't reply, not yet. Instead, I set the phone down beside my half-eaten toast and looked out the window at a city that didn't care who had or hadn't believed in me. Cities are like that. They reward the ones who stay up late and keep trying even after everyone tells them to go to sleep. When I opened LinkedIn, it was a carnival of false memory. My old boss had written a post about being proud to have mentored such a visionary leader, which was funny considering he once told me I was too emotional for leadership. He even attached a picture from an office holiday party where I'm smiling with the polite terror of someone who knows her contract won't be renewed. Beneath his post, dozens of people were congratulating him on his influence. I closed the tab before the taste of irony turned into something bitter. Revenge doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it's just realizing how many people will rewrite history when they smell success nearby. Mom called around noon, her tone overly cheerful, her words tumbling over each other like laundry caught in a dryer. "Honey, we're so proud. You must be thrilled. Everyone's been talking about it all morning." I asked her if everyone included the people who hadn't thought to invite me last night, and she hesitated just long enough to confirm it. "That was just your sister's idea," she said, as if cruelty could be subcontracted. I could have pressed harder, could have listed every small dismissal that had shaped me, but what's the point? You don't debate history with the people who edited it. Instead, I told her I was happy, that I had a few interviews lined up, and that I'd be flying out soon for meetings. It wasn't a lie. The meetings were real. The happiness was a work in progress. By afternoon, journalists were calling, asking for sound bites about the deal, about being a woman in tech, about what empowerment meant to me. I gave them clean, careful answers because the story wasn't about empowerment, it was about survival, and survival doesn't make for good headlines. Still, each new article fed the wildfire. By sunset, my name had circled back to people who hadn't spoken to me since high school, and my sister, unable to resist the spotlight, had started commenting on posts about me, writing things like, "So proud of my brilliant sis," under photos of us that she hadn't taken herself. Watching her parade borrowed pride was almost comical. The woman who once introduced me as the artistic one because unemployed sounded too harsh was now trying to attach herself to my name like a brand partnership. When she called again that evening, I answered, not because I wanted to talk, but because curiosity is its own form of indulgence. She launched into a breathless speech about how crazy everything was, how the whole family wanted to take me out to celebrate, how she hoped we could move past the silly dinner misunderstanding. Her words were soft, but her tone betrayed the urgency of someone trying to re-enter a room they'd locked from the inside. I let her talk until she ran out of breath, then said, "Sure. Maybe next week. I'm a little busy now." The silence that followed was heavy, a pause where she must have realized she was no longer directing the scene. Then she laughed awkwardly and said, "Of course you are. The successful ones always are." After we hung up, I opened a bottle of wine that had been waiting in my kitchen for a moment that deserved to be remembered. I poured a glass, not as a toast, but as a marker, the line between the life I used to explain and the one that could now explain itself. I thought about the irony of it all. For years, I had measured worth by proximity to their approval, by how many smiles I could collect at family dinners that felt more like auditions. Now, without changing anything about who I was, I had become someone they suddenly wanted to be seen with. Success doesn't change you, it just turns the lights on. You see who's been standing near you and who's been waiting for you to glow before they step closer. Later that night, when the noise had died down and the congratulations had thinned to a manageable stream, I opened my messages again and read through the dozens of apologies disguised as congratulations. The subtext was always the same: "Now that you matter, we'd like to matter to you." I didn't reply to any of them. I didn't need to. Revenge, I realized, isn't about shouting from the stage. It's about quietly owning the theater. And as I sat there with my half-empty glass, my phone face down, and my inbox overflowing, I understood that silence wasn't just my defense anymore. It was the language of power, and I was finally fluent. By the time my sister suggested that we all get together properly this time, I already knew what kind of performance she was planning to stage. Families like mine thrive on revision. They retell the past until it fits the mood of the present, and now that my name had become shorthand for something impressive, they wanted a sequel where everyone could pretend they were there from the first act. I agreed without hesitation, not because I needed the reunion, but because I wanted to see how they would look under new lighting, how the same faces that once evaluated me like a resume would perform gratitude when the hierarchy had shifted. I chose the restaurant carefully, a quiet, expensive place with soft lighting and no music, the kind of place where every word lands like glass. I booked a private room, arranged for the bill to come directly to me, and even ordered a pre-dinner bottle of wine that my sister used to mock as pretentious. Every detail was a mirror I had angled just right. When I walked in, they were already there, my mother with her polite excitement, my father fidgeting with the menu as if prices could still embarrass him, my sister adjusting her hair with the restless confidence of someone trying to remember which version of herself she was supposed to be tonight. I smiled and greeted them as though I had just run into them by accident in a city where I had long since moved on. My sister stood up too fast, hugged me too long, and whispered, "I'm so proud of you, really," with a tremor that was either sincerity or rehearsal. I chose not to decide. I sat down, poured the wine, and waited for the conversation to find its rhythm. It started predictably, questions about the company, about how it felt, about whether I'd ever imagined something like this. I gave them answers that sounded polished, but carried no intimacy, the kind of answers you give journalists who ask about your journey. My sister laughed too often, inserting herself into my stories as though she had co-founded the company, recalling how she'd always told me to take risks. My mother nodded along, her smile firm but nervous, like someone hoping not to be tested on a subject she didn't study. My father raised a toast to family success, his voice just slightly too loud, his eyes just slightly unsure of where to land. Between courses, I watched them attempt to stitch our history into something wholesome. My sister talked about childhood memories that she'd never bothered to revisit before, painting us as two halves of a supportive duo rather than the competition we had always been. My mother spoke about how proud your father and I have always been, though I could remember specific birthdays when they hadn't called. I let them talk. There is a peculiar kind of pleasure in watching people build illusions that you no longer need to live inside. It is not cruelty, it is clarity. When dessert arrived, my sister leaned in with that careful smile that announces a favor disguised as conversation. "You know," she began, swirling her wine with studied nonchalance, "I've been thinking about expanding the boutique. Maybe something international. People always say I have an eye for design. And with your new connections, maybe there's a way we could." She didn't finish, because she didn't need to. The assumption hung in the air like perfume. I set my glass down gently, looked at her for a long moment, and said, "It's a competitive space. You'd need a strong foundation, good strategy, realistic expectations. It's not easy to scale something like that." She blinked, waiting for the part where I'd volunteer help, but it didn't come. I smiled and added, "Still, if you're serious, I can recommend a few consultants. Independent ones." The word independent landed exactly where I wanted it to. The silence that followed was exquisite. My mother cleared her throat. My father signaled for another drink he didn't need. My sister's expression rearranged itself into politeness. For the rest of the evening, the conversation stayed on safer ground, vacations, recipes, neighborhood gossip, but the tension had changed shape. They were no longer performing dominance. They were auditioning for relevance. And I let them, offering small nods and small smiles, the kind that looked generous from across the table but mean nothing up close. When the check came, I didn't wait for the awkward shuffle of hands reaching for wallets. I simply took it, signed it, and thanked the waiter. My father started to protest, out of habit more than pride, but I interrupted with a soft laugh. Please. You've paid for enough dinners I didn't enjoy. He didn't know whether to laugh or apologize, so he didn't either. As we stood to leave, my sister hugged me again, tighter this time, and said, "Let's not wait so long next time." Her perfume was the same as always, heavy and sweet, and for a moment I was 12 again, standing beside her at some family function, both of us pretending to be close because that was what looked good in photographs. I said, "We'll see," in a tone that sounded almost affectionate, and she smiled, unsure whether to believe it. Outside, the night air was cool and clean. I watched them walk toward their car, their silhouettes folding back into the familiar shape of a trio that used to move through life without me. They didn't turn around, and neither did I. As I waited for my own car, I thought about how success doesn't erase history. It just changes the language people use to describe it. The same family that once called me reckless now called me brave. The same decisions that were mistakes last year were now visionary risks. The translation was efficient, if not sincere. When the car pulled up, I took one last look at the restaurant window, where our table was still glowing under the amber light. 3 empty glasses, 1 untouched dessert, a crumpled napkin, evidence of a truce no one had really signed. I felt neither triumph nor anger, only distance, and in that distance there was peace. Not the kind that reconciles, but the kind that finally stops explaining. Tomorrow they would tell their version of the dinner, and I would let them, because I had learned something better than winning. Sometimes power is not in what you say, but in how little you need to repeat yourself. In the days after the second dinner, the story began to write itself without my help, with relatives calling to report that they had never seen the family so united. Which was a charming way to describe a temporary ceasefire negotiated by the sudden presence of money, while my sister sent a carefully edited string of texts about synergy and brand extensions, and a pop-up collaboration she insisted could elevate us both, and my mother, sensing momentum, added a sweet message about second chances and how good it felt to be a team again, as if we had ever played the same sport. Yet, even as the noise gathered, I kept to the plans I had made the night the headline went public, because victory that cannot stand alone is just a sugar rush with a press release, and I wanted something that would feed people who had never been invited to anyone's dinner at all. The scholarship announcement went out on a weekday morning when inboxes were fresh and attention was still generous. A simple page with a plain title and a photograph that looked like possibility rather than triumph, and the text said what I meant without metaphors. That we would fund founders who had been told to wait politely while others cut the line, that the money would cover the unglamorous costs that kill good ideas before they are big enough to be loved, that mentorship would be provided by people who remembered exactly how doors feel when they do not open, and that applicants would need to show not just a pitch, but a paper trail, work done when applause was absent, progress made when nobody posted about it, actual customers who existed offline, and in a small paragraph near the bottom sat the sentence I wrote with a strange, careful joy, the eligibility note that the grant favored those without family safety nets, because the world is full of talent. But only some of it can afford to fail softly. The calls increased before lunch, a pleasant storm of friends offering help and strangers offering partnership, and a few old skeptics who wanted the language softened so that no one would feel left out, which I politely declined, since exclusion had never seemed to trouble them until the door opened outward, and by mid-afternoon the first applicants had already arrived with cover letters that smelled like late nights and reheated dinners, with screenshots of invoices and community notes and broken shoes repaired with determination and tape, and as I read them I felt something unclench that the deal itself had not touched, because this was the opposite of proving myself to a room that had been miscounting chairs for years. This was choosing my room and choosing my guests and paying the check with gratitude instead of spite. My sister waited a respectful 48 hours before calling with a tone that tried for businesslike, but landed on breathless, and she pitched her collaboration again with the smoothness of someone who believes that a trend can substitute for a plan. Except this time she added the weight of family history to the mix and suggested that I could start with a small investment to show good faith, and when I asked what problem the money would solve, she said, with the earnestness of a person who Confuses taste with traction, that the boutique just needed to be seen by the right people, at which point I told her about the scholarship's preference clause, about the way we were weighting applications toward those without cushioning, about how many brilliant founders never even get to the table, and I asked her, as evenly as I could manage, to write me a one-page memo outlining the specific customers she served, the margins she maintained, and the risk she herself was prepared to accept. Because if she wanted to be treated like a founder, she would need to behave like one, not like a lobbyist for proximity. Silence is a complicated instrument, and hers stretched across the line like a wire I did not intend to pluck, and then she said she would send the memo that night, which of course she did not. Though what did arrive at midnight was a long message about family and loyalty and how support should not require paperwork, followed by a shorter one that asked whether she qualified for the scholarship. And I stared at the question until the absurdity dissolved into a kind of weary affection, because even entitlement has a foolish child's face when it finally asks out loud what it has always taken for granted, so I answered in the only way that felt honest, that the scholarship was for people whose families had not invited them to the table when the food was scarce, that it was meant to interrupt a pattern rather than preserve one, that I loved her in the way you love someone you grew up with and would still not hire, and that if she wanted help I would meet her as a peer with terms and timelines, not as a donor with a velvet envelope. I expected anger or tears or one of those midnight monologues where she lists everything she once did for me and forgets the receipt she wrote the night she created a guest list without my name, yet what came the next morning was stranger and, in its way, more human. A photograph of our father in his workshop standing behind a half-finished table he had promised would seat everyone, a table that never made it to a dining room because life interrupted with bills and repairs and small emergencies that became large ones, and beneath the photograph she wrote only that she had found it while cleaning and that maybe we both inherited different halves of his unfinished projects, and I sat with that for a long time. Because it was not an apology and not an accusation, just a shard of context offered without demand. In the week that followed, I sent her the consultant list I had mentioned at dinner. I introduced her to a modest accountant who would not flatter her. I declined to invest and declined to explain the decline twice. And I finalized the scholarship's first cohort, 8 people who had been told in 100 creative ways that they were not invited to the world's nicer rooms. And when the press called to ask whether this initiative was my answer to the family saga that had briefly animated social media with its petty glamour, I gave them a line about systems and luck and late nights, and then hung up, because some stories only grow smaller when you keep telling them. A month later, on a gray morning that smelled like rain and fresh coffee, I received a calendar invite from my sister with a subject line that did not make promises, only time. And the location was not a restaurant, but a public park near the workshop where our father had kept his tools, and I accepted without comment, then closed the laptop and walked to the window where the city was doing its usual, indifferent miracle of continuing. And I realized that revenge, when it is finally clean, looks less like victory and more like the right to set your terms without raising your voice, which is a privilege I intend to guard like a secret, even as I opened the group chat I had left and hovered over the button that would let me return, not to reconcile, and not to perform, but perhaps to listen long enough to decide whether staying gone is the truer kindness, and then I set the phone down without pressing anything at all, letting the question breathe beside the coffee as the rain began.